All right. We can turn this around and talk with you a while about yourself and your podcast. So, welcome on to the RPG podcast, Nick Kempin. Tell us about yourself.
So, my name is Nick Kempin. I live in Japan, Tokyo specifically. I've lived here for a little over 2 years now. I'm studying Japanese. I'm always studying Japanese, trying to get better at it. Hopefully I'll be hitting N2 level by next December, so I can apply for Kokugakuen University here in Tokyo and train on becoming a Shinto priest, if all goes according to plan.
What's your connection to Legend of the Five Rings? How did you get it into that in the first place?
So, my very first time really learning anything about L5R was probably back in 2002, and that was seeing Oriental Adventures, the 3.0 D&D version of it, and seeing it in a library, and just really being interested in the idea of samurai as something you could roleplay as. So for me, that was like kind of my first introduction, but I never really explored L5R outside of that book originally, not until probably the same year that Ivory Edition came out. That's when, at a convention, I saw some fantastic, beautiful artwork of some of the characters in L5R. And I just, at that point, I'm like, okay, I need to know what this is from. And that's how I really originally got into it, was playing in Ivory Edition up until the end of the previous version. I didn't really play the RPG until 5th edition.
Cool. Can you tell us about Tokyo of the Five Rings and what you're planning to do with that podcast?
Yeah, Tokyo of the Five Rings is trying to delve into the cultures that are behind Legend of the Five Rings. The goal is to look into both Japanese culture as well as Shinto, Buddhism, Confucianism to an extent, and further on hopefully talk a little bit about the other East Asian cultures that inspire parts of L5R. The goal is to explore these cultures as well as show how these cultures may be misrepresented to an extent in L5R, correct some misconceptions, and suggesting ways to improve your game.
All right. Do you actually play L5R in an RPG or anything there in Tokyo with other folks from Japan?
Yeah, so I actually have played L5R a couple times out here in Tokyo. We got a small little group that meets up probably once, twice a month at a game store. It's a whole chain of game stores called Yellow Submarine. But we meet up at one of them and we play the LCG. Specifically, we're playing the skirmish format, because it's easier to learn and get people interested, especially with the amount of rules necessary to learn the main game for a game that's not translated into Japanese. So we definitely want to use the easiest version to try and explain it to people, because my Japanese is not good enough to explain all the amount of information that the base game has. It's a lot.
Okay. I was just like, how is it viewed over there? Have you done the role-playing game too, or have other people been interested in it? How's it received?
So there's a mixed feeling about it, to be honest. The people I've played with, people from Japan, from Taiwan, from Thailand. We've got a whole bunch of different people out here who have played the game. But there's definitely mixed feelings about it, especially from the Japanese community, because you're making everything Japanese. You got all these other cultures that are showing up, but you put on this layer of Japanese, and it makes a lot of the players out here feel like all of East Asia is just assumed to be the same, very homogenized. So there's definitely this view of that's a little weird, but then at the same time it's like, but we get to play as mystical samurai, and that's cool. We haven't really been able to experience this from an American perspective, so that's interesting. So it's got this kind of back and forth of there's some cool things they're doing with our culture, there's some bad things they're doing with their culture. They're making our culture seem homogenized. They're doing this. So it's very hit or miss, it feels.
Are there specific things that really seem to be... So you've mentioned the kind of mushing together of cultures as an issue. Are there other things that kind of show up?
Yeah, so one of the big ones is the use of kami from Shinto. Not the word kami, but specific kami. For example, Amaterasu Omikami, Inari Okami. My brain just melted on me. But there's a good chunk of the kami in L5R, often referred to as fortunes in L5R, are from the actual religion out here, from Shinto. So there's this thought of, why are they using our gods in not Japan? For example, they do use kami in a lot of other media, like an anime called Noragami, where you have the kami shown in a very fantastical way. It takes place in kind of modern Japan. But the difference there is that it's still taking place in Japan. So it makes sense for the kami to be there, and it respects and pays homage to the originating myths. Where when you pull them away from Japan and insert them into a fantasy world, you start getting issues. For example, in L5R, you have the concept of like cleanliness being really important, purification. So you've done at shrines and whatnot. In L5R, it's the same in Japan. The difference, though, is that in Japan, the reasoning there you can find in mythology. You can find where they kind of originates in myth. But because the myths aren't the same and are closer to, in a lot of ways, Greek mythology, you don't have that same connection. So you don't have this, hey, purification is important because Izanagi Okami, after he escaped the underworld, purified himself, and born from that was Amaterasu Omikami and a whole bunch of others. You get this disconnect. Where does that originate? Is it important to the society if you don't have an originating point? Another complaint I get is actually about Bushido. So a lot of Japanese people are really hesitant about that because Bushido was created in like the late 1800s, early 1900s, almost as a kind of a propaganda tool of what samurai were for the West. And then that same information ended up being used by the military government of Japan to basically say, hey, you're all samurai, we're all going to fight and die for the emperor. And it led to a lot of atrocities during World War I and World War II. So you got these issues that derive from the word Bushido and it being anachronistic to what samurai actually were. So those are the issues that I've noticed out here with.
What kind of things might be liked out there? What kind of things have people enjoyed, if anything?
Actually, people do enjoy aspects of it. They like the mono no aware aspect of the game. That's a mechanic that you don't really see in a lot of games. And they like the homage to Japanese culture that comes from that. Because mono no aware is very important to Japanese culture. Seeing that encapsulated in a game is really revolutionary in a lot of ways. So that's one thing that really sticks out. The fact that most of the artwork is done by Asian and Japanese people specifically is another thing where you can see that aspect. It's like, wow, they're paying attention to artists out here. And then some of the art is very traditional Japanese design. That's really pretty. I really like that. Some of the names hit or miss. You have some where it's like, that's like a proper Japanese name. That sounds really good. I like this character. Then you have another one where it's, that's not Japanese. Like, where does the name Huleng come from? That sounds Chinese. That one hits a lot of issues in Japan, to be honest. But there are definitely some positives. In regards to the lore, people seem to really like the aspect of people trying to be better. The conflict between one's duty and what one wants to do. That a lot in kind of Confucian society as well. You have to put yourself second to the family or to your duty compared to what you would have to do if you wanted to do it your way. That a lot actually here in Japan right now. You have this conflict between kind of the individualist society and the collectivist society that's developing, both from Western influences and from traditional Japanese and Confucian influences. So you see that to an extent encapsulated in L5R, and some Japanese people really like that, being able to experience that through a game.
That's really interesting. It is fascinating to hear a different perspective.
Yeah, no, I've really enjoyed my time out here interacting with Japanese people and trying to see how this game does out here in the thought process. So it's been very interesting.